I speak to you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In my text, I came that you might have life, and that more abundantly. You know, Time magazine featured an article called The Angelina Effect. When Angelina Jolie went public with her double mastectomy and reconstructive surgery, she did so to encourage women with the same genetic defect for cancer to do the same. To declare this breast surgery when you're a woman who is a star, whose income comes directly from great beauty, is a very risky thing to do. She said, I don't feel any less of a woman. I feel empowered that I made a strong choice that in no way diminishes my femininity. In her brief description of her breast reconstruction, she said the results can be beautiful. She reassured her children, saying that they could see the small scars, but other than that, everything else is, quotes, just mummy. No doubt in my mind that this decision was one of great personal courage, because it was to overcome a sense of vulnerability that all of us have. Angelina, for the good of other people, had to dare greatly. Now, when I read this article, I thought of Theodore Roosevelt's words. It's not the critic who counts, not the person who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, and who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. You know, when you're a performer of any kind, and you're in any form of leadership, you've got to put yourself out there for everybody to see. When I was 7 years old, I was a boy soprano. And at that age, I really felt vulnerable and very easily shamed. My parents put me in a context where other children were to sing. We were all given numbers, big numbers. I was given a number 9, which in my mind was a number 6. So when number 6 was called, I dutifully went up to sing. Before I started, I was told that I was not to sing. It was another child's turn. Confused, mortified, I left the stage and returned to my parents' seat and started to cry. I thought to myself, if I keep this crying up, I won't have to sing. And sure enough, each time they tried again for me to come up, I was still crying. I thought to myself, this crying stuff really works. You know, the best book I ever read on vulnerability is Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. She says that vulnerability is the cradle of the emotions and experiences that we crave. She says it's the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. And you say, what? You know, I think we all know that loving another person can be a very risky business. We can be deliriously happy or get hurt badly. Nothing about love is certain. But can you imagine life without love? But if we want love to be in our lives, we have to be vulnerable. Being safe all the time simply does not work. When it comes to life, being safe is like holding our number upside down and crying louder each time it's called by life. So what's the answer to loving life? Vulnerability. vulnerability, the willingness to put yourself out there, risk losing everything you have in order to gain what can mean the world to you. And as we get older, we put on masks to protect ourselves, or even wear armor. You see, getting hurt is no fun, so we learn to be careful, hold the mask up to the world, or even armor plate. And this covered behavior kills our passion, puts down our purpose, and we start to disengage. We want to control outcomes and people. Power becomes important, as does financial independence, all in the name of avoiding being vulnerable. You see, feeling vulnerable doesn't feel good to us at all, and yet paradoxically, it's often the only way forward. Paradoxically, because we know that what happens when we share an unpopular opinion or political position, or when we ask for help, it's interpreted as incompetence or inexperience, and we can get dumped on big time. We also have come to believe that vulnerability is weakness. Have you ever started a new job and been afraid to ask for help because you're supposed to be the expert that's been hired? And so you don't ask for help, and you don't do a good job with a high expectation. And people think that they hired the wrong person when all the time you are competent, but afraid to ask for help with a few little things that you didn't know. I once talked to a lawyer who said that when you come out of law school, you know the most law that you will ever know, but you don't know how to apply it because you don't have the experience. So yes, you're a qualified expert, but you need connections. You can't get those connections without help, no matter how brave a front you put on. And if we're afraid to admit vulnerability, then it's going to be a problem for us to ask for help. To get there, we're going to have to drop the importance of other people's opinions of us. I love the little book with its title, "What You Think of Me Is None of My Business." When do we feel vulnerable? Well, when we get fired, when we're waiting for cancer or not diagnosis, when we get into a bathing suit, especially when we're out of shape, after a public failure of some kind, or a public attempt to shame us, when we present our art to the world and there's no market for it. Why do we feel vulnerable? Because we are caring about what others think about us all the time, and we don't want to be shamed or ashamed or to be considered a failure. But I want to ask this morning, when we fail and try again, is that weakness? When we get the wrong number called and go up again and sing our heart out, is that weakness? When we get fired and start all over again, is that weakness? When we get into the bathing suit and enjoy the water anyway, is that weakness or is it courage? I've always had a fear that the day would come when I had a carefully prepared sermon and would lose it before I went into the pulpit. I'd have dreams about this often. Waking up in a cold sweat with this nightmare scenario. Now I know this about myself. I can preach with or without notes, but I always feel that the presentation is stronger with notes than without, in most cases. If it's a subject with which I'm really familiar, that's quite different. I don't need notes at all. I've got great freedom. But for new subjects, I always have notes. However, one Sunday came in Westminster Presbyterian in Sacramento, opposite the state capitol, where all sorts of important people were sitting in the pews. Where did I leave my notes? I was sitting on the dais at the front. No idea where I put them down. I was flummoxed. Nightmare was coming true. I wouldn't be able to go on, etc., just like the nightmare. I told the person next to me that I'd lost my notes, and he asked whether he could go and look for them, which I thought was very kind of him. And the courage suddenly came. I said, no, I can do it without them. So for the next few minutes, my brain went into high gear to try to remember the opening, the quotes, at least in gist. I decided to abandon the pulpit and walk to the center of the church and just preach. I did. I got through it. I think the folks thought I was innovating. I felt so naked. Brené Brown writes from her research that this feeling naked is the heart of vulnerability. Vulnerability, she says, is like being naked on stage, hoping for applause rather than laughter. It's being naked when everyone else is fully clothed. You see, the very interesting thing is this. We enjoy seeing vulnerability in others, but we don't want to be vulnerable ourselves. And I think this is part of the attraction of Facebook. Some people are really very open on Facebook, willing to write anything or be pictured in compromised photos. And we admire the person who's really out there and has no mask. But we're also aware of the dangers as well. If we're applying for a job, a visit to Facebook can kill the application right there. I can remember a presbytery meeting where someone was a candidate for ministry and was hauled on the carpet for his honest theological doubts, which he shared on Facebook. He was being vulnerable in public. I liked his honesty. So I got onto the floor and defended his right to do this. Afterwards, he understood just what the cost was. You see, if you want a job, don't use Facebook to express your doubts about the job. It's a narrow thing, but he did get through. I thought afterwards it took courage to put it out there, but there was a price. But being vulnerable doesn't mean crashing through boundaries, your own or those of other people. That comes from the lack of self-esteem, a whole other subject. Sharing your precious dreams with others before they're hatched or germinated is not wise, unless you really trust the person you're sharing it with. You see, all of us have got this dark side to our human nature. All of us have got it. The people you want as friends are the people who choose to live by their best side. These folks are in the arena with you as you sweat blood and tears. They understand the struggle. They don't sit in the bleachers with their duck guns leveled at you. They're the ones who pick you up after a failure or a disgrace of some kind. They're the ones who are ready to believe in you and give you a new start. They're the ones who love your decision to have strong boundaries and your choice to be vulnerable. If you can, be such a friend. For me, the most amazing aha moment in Brené Brown's research came when she identified the strategy that most of us use to avoid feeling vulnerable. In order not to feel vulnerable, we numb ourselves as best we can. We get addicted. We go into debt. We get obese. We drug away the pain. You know, numbing sells a lot of beer and alcohol and prescription drugs. There's another widely used strategy, which is now an all-American disease. We try to cope with life's ambiguities by trying to make the uncertain certain. Brené Brown says that when it comes to religion, instead of religion becoming a search for faith and mystery, we say, I'm right, you're wrong, so shut up. Or worse, we resort to violence in the name of God. In politics, she says, we're so numb there's no discourse or reasoned discussion anymore. It's now a blame game. Blame is defined psychologically as the way to discharge pain and discomfort. This is a very dangerous cycle, as we've got ourselves into, largely due to the fact that we do not, under any circumstance, want to let others see us as we really are. It's too terrifying. So we numb out joy, gratitude, and happiness in the avoidance of vulnerability. Ahead of Angelina Jolie, Rowena Kincaid actually put pictures of herself on Facebook going through chemo. She started off with this glorious, beautiful black hair that had body. She underwent chemo, lost it all in stages. Rowena, with courage, put it all out on Facebook. She says in order to encourage others undergoing chemo, there's a picture of her there completely bald. At Knox, I am so glad we have a successful wig ministry for people losing their hair during chemo. The wig tides them over until the hair regrows. People who receive wigs are so grateful. But as the Scots often say, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after gley. For instance, Kathleen Kelly hid her fear of being bald in public with a beautiful, very convincing wig. It was a great strategy until the day came when it was windy. Kathleen Kelly writes she did not know whether Jim had asked her out as a date or for a friendly get-together. They were walking along together and it was very, very windy. Kathleen asked herself, do I hold on to my hair? No, because he's going to know that I'm wearing a wig. This, she says, was not the best decision she ever made. The wind whipped her hair off her head, showing her bald head to the world. Jim was walking ahead of her, unaware of the chaos unfolding behind him. After what seemed like minutes, he did turn around and he was suddenly in on her secret. She turned to run after her hair, but decided it was not such a good idea with her new hip replacement, so she quickly said, would you get my hair? What a way to impress a new boyfriend. Jim took off after it. Please God, she said, don't let it get into the street. As it was, it sort of looked like a squirrel running through piles of dirt. I've got it, Jim said. Terrific, she thought, just glad the whole thing was not on YouTube. Jim came up to her and returned her hair, and his eyes seemed to say, here's your hair. I didn't see anything. He looked to her like he was dying for her. Wishing she did not have to go through this, Kathleen started to laugh and could not stop. Tears flowed down her cheeks. She shook out the dirt, tried to reposition the wig back on her head, and she said, Jim, did you know that I'd had cancer? He said, yes. Did you know I was wearing a wig? No. They continued their walk until they got to their destination, where Kathleen went into the ladies' room, saw that she had the wig on backwards. She sat down on the floor of the washroom and laughed herself silly for the longest time before she came out again. Here she'd wanted to appear as a 28-year-old going out on a date without having to tell someone she had breast cancer and a bone marrow transplant. She gathered all of her courage to accept this invitation from Jim, and now this. To her total surprise, this turned out to be one of the best decisions she had ever made. She experienced from Jim true acceptance and compassion. You see, it had been a date. And after the wig blew off, the chemistry was still there and remained so. Brené Brown would describe the sort of decision that Jim and Angelina and Rowena made as living life in a wholehearted way. Now, Kathleen and Jim laugh at what actually brought them closer together. You know, the world religions all instruct us that life is to be more abundant. But that abundant life has often lessons that come through the vulnerability. For instance, the one who said, I came to give you life, and that more abundantly, also became vulnerable. Scholars think that Jesus was naked on the cross. They say, well, a crucifixion was an execution. It was also a humiliation by making the condemned as vulnerable as possible. Although artists have traditionally depicted the figure on the cross with a loincloth, the person being crucified was usually stripped naked. The Buddha plumbed the depths of vulnerability, suffering for authenticity until his bones were so evident that they poked through his skin. Socrates allowed himself to be vulnerable to death in order to live an authentic life. So how do we live abundantly and yet be open to the gifts that can come from vulnerability? We let Brené Brown become our teacher, and she says, let your true self be seen. Love with your whole heart. Realize that in life there are no guarantees. Practice gratitude and joy. Believe that you are enough. What is often the gift that comes from our most vulnerable movements? Rediscovering our authentic self. How very cool is that?